Little bit of job here. I started buying and selling stuff. Basically educated myself. And then I'd always been buying and selling stuff. My dad had a little coin shop, and I wanted a pawn shop.
The bright lights of the Las Vegas Strip have witnessed countless fortunes made and lost. But inside the world-famous gold and silver pawn shop, something far more dramatic than any high-stakes gamble was quietly unfolding behind the cameras, away from the roar of the crowd, away from the thrill of the deal. You've watched them negotiate. You've cheered when they scored a legendary item. You've laughed at the banter. But what you never saw, what the producers never wanted you to see, was the tension simmering just beneath the surface.
And I wanted a pawn shop. So I went down to City Hall, and they told me, no, you can't get a pawn shop.
In Las Vegas.
The arguments that happened after the director called cut, the frustration that built up over seasons, the relationships that quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, fell apart. Rick Harrison has built an empire on his ability to read people. He can spot a fake from across the room. He can sense when a seller is hiding something. So when relationships inside his own shop began to fracture, Rick saw it coming long before anyone else did. And when he made his decisions, cold, calculated, final, those departures sent shockwaves through the Pawn Stars universe that fans are still talking about today. So here's the question that everyone has been asking but nobody has fully answered. What really happened between Rick Harrison and these 5 cast members? What drove them apart? And why, once those bridges were burned, did Rick Harrison refuse to look back? Stay with us, because the real story of Pawn Stars is far more complex, far more human, and far more revealing than anything you ever saw on television. This is the untold truth, and it starts now. Who is Rick Harrison, and why does it matter? Before we dive into the departures, the feuds, and the stunning fallouts, you need to understand one fundamental truth about Rick Harrison. He is not just a TV personality. He is not just a pawn shop owner who got lucky with a camera crew. Rick Harrison is a self-made businessman who built something rare in this world, an institution. The gold and silver pawn shop didn't become world famous by accident. Rick built it on decades of work, sharp instincts, and an unrelenting drive to be the best at what he does. He taught himself history, art, militaria, jewelry, and antiques, not because someone told him to, but because knowledge was his weapon and his edge in a business where ignorance costs you everything. Think about that for a moment. A man who struggled with epilepsy as a child, who faced real challenges in school, who was told the odds were against him. That same man built a pawn shop dynasty that spawned one of the most watched reality television franchises in history. That takes more than luck. That takes an iron will and a very specific, very uncompromising vision of how things should be done. And here's where things get interesting. When you have that kind of vision, when you have fought that hard for what you built, you become intensely protective of it. You become intolerant of anything or anyone that threatens the integrity of what you've created. Rick Harrison doesn't just run a business, he guards it. He protects it the way a lion guards its territory. That protectiveness, that fierce, unflinching commitment to his standards, is the key to understanding everything that follows. Because when the people around him didn't meet those standards, when personalities clashed with his vision, when the delicate chemistry of the show began to corrode from the inside, Rick Harrison did what Rick Harrison always does. He made a decision, and he didn't look back. Are you ready to find out what those decisions really cost? Let's start with the man who many consider the beating heart of Pawn Stars itself, the original son and the price of fame. Corey Harrison grew up inside the gold and silver pawn shop. While other kids were playing outside, Corey was learning the difference between genuine Civil War memorabilia and convincing fakes. While his friends were figuring out their futures, Corey already had his mapped out for him, or so it seemed. He was the heir apparent, the next generation of the Harrison dynasty, groomed from childhood to one day take the reins of the family empire. And for years, that's exactly the role he played. Big Hoss, as fans lovingly called him, brought humor, heart, and relatability to Pawn Stars. He was the everyman of the show, the guy viewers felt they could actually have a beer with. Where Rick was polished and knowledgeable, Corey was rough around the edges in the best possible way. Together, they created a dynamic that millions of fans found irresistible. But here's what the cameras didn't fully capture: the weight of growing up in your father's shadow, the pressure of inheriting not just a business, but a legacy, an expectation, a television brand that the whole world was watching. Can you imagine what that feels like? Every decision you make, every deal you close, every mistake you make, all of it scrutinized not just by your father, but by millions of viewers who have formed opinions about who you are and what you're worth. The tension between Rick and Corey wasn't explosive in the way that some of the other conflicts we'll discuss were. It was something slower, something more painful. The gradual erosion of a father-son relationship under the crushing weight of cameras, contracts, and commercial expectations. Corey's personal struggles became very public. His battle with weight, his romantic life, his search for identity outside of his famous surname. These were things that played out on screen in ways that weren't always flattering and weren't always fair. And behind those storylines were real human beings trying to navigate an extraordinarily difficult situation. Here's the question you have to ask yourself. When family and business intertwine the way they do at the gold and silver pawn shop, where does one end and the other begin? When Rick Harrison looks at Corey, does he see his son first? Or does he see an employee, a cast member, a business asset? And when those identities begin to pull in different directions, something has to give. The relationship between Rick and Corey went through periods of serious strain. Sources close to the production described an environment where expectations were sky high and patience sometimes ran dangerously thin. Rick's exacting standards, the very standards that built the empire, could become an impossible burden for someone trying to forge their own identity, while simultaneously living up to a legend. What makes this particularly poignant is that Corey never stopped trying. He invested in the business. He worked to make himself a better appraiser, a sharper negotiator. He genuinely wanted to honor what his family had built. But wanting something and being able to thrive within its demands are two very different things. Dennis Collins, the man who understood better than most what it means to watch talented people struggle within systems that don't always have room for them, would have recognized this dynamic immediately. Sometimes the people closest to the center of a success story are the ones who pay the highest personal price. The legend who became larger than the show. If Corey Harrison represented the next generation struggling to find his place, Chumlee Russell represented something entirely different, and in many ways, something far more complicated for Rick Harrison to navigate. Austin Lee Russell, known universally as Chumlee, was never supposed to be a star. Let that sink in for a second. He came to the show as Corey's childhood friend, a background presence, someone filling space in the frame while the real action happened around him. Nobody, not the producers, not the network, and certainly not Rick Harrison, predicted what was about to happen. The audience fell in love with Chumlee. Not just liked him, genuinely, passionately, obsessively loved him. His humor was effortless. His willingness to be the butt of every joke, to play the lovable fool while secretly revealing moments of surprising insight, made him one of the most naturally magnetic personalities in reality television history. Fan mail poured in for Chumlee. Merchandise bearing his face outsold everyone else on the show. When Pawn Stars toured, the lines to meet Chumlee were longer than the lines for Rick himself. Now stop and think about that from Rick Harrison's perspective. You built this. You created this show on the foundation of your expertise, your knowledge, your decades of work, and the person stealing your thunder is your employee's best friend, who was never even supposed to be a main character. To Rick's credit, he handled much of this gracefully. He understood the value Chumlee brought to the ratings. He recognized that the show's appeal lay in its ensemble chemistry, not just in showcasing his encyclopedic knowledge of antiques. But beneath that professional understanding, there were reportedly real tensions. Moments where the imbalance of Chumlee's popularity versus his role in the actual business became a source of friction. The situation reached a critical point in 2016. Chumlee's legal troubles, and they were serious, put the entire show in jeopardy. Law enforcement executed a search warrant at his home in connection with an investigation, and what they found led to multiple felony charges. The fallout was immediate and severe. Here's where Rick Harrison's character was truly tested. What do you do when someone who has become synonymous with your brand, someone whose face is on merchandise sold in your store, someone the world associates with your name? What do you do when that person brings the kind of trouble that could destroy everything you've built? The answer Rick landed on was complicated, nuanced, and ultimately revealing of exactly how he operates. He didn't immediately throw Chumlee under the bus, but the relationship was fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The trust that forms the bedrock of any working relationship had been shaken in ways that couldn't simply be repaired with an apology and a promise to do better. Chumlee eventually pleaded guilty to felony weapon and drug charges and was sentenced to 3 years of probation. He returned to the show, but things were different. The easy chemistry, the spontaneous humor, the sense that everyone on screen genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Some of that was gone, replaced by something more careful, more calculated, more performed. For Rick Harrison, a man who had spent decades cultivating an image of trustworthiness and expertise, having that image threatened by association was not something he could simply shrug off. His strong protective instincts, the same instincts that had driven his success, were now in direct conflict with the loyalty and affection he felt for someone who had been part of his world for years. Could the relationship have been saved if the circumstances had been different? Could better communication, better support systems, better boundaries have prevented the public fallout? These are the questions that linger long after the cameras stop rolling. When the old man's era came to an end, there are moments in television history that shift everything, moments that mark a clear line between what came before and what comes after. The loss of Richard Harrison, the old man, was one of those moments. Richard Benjamin Harrison Sr. was more than a cast member. He was the soul of Pawn Stars, his dry wit, his apparent grumpiness that barely concealed a deep warmth, his willingness to be the straight man to everyone else's comedy. These weren't performance choices. That was simply who he was. And viewers, with their extraordinary ability to sense authenticity, loved him for it. The old man represented something precious in the world of reality television, genuine, unvarnished humanity. He didn't need to perform. He didn't need to be dramatic for the cameras. He was simply himself, and himself was riveting. The deterioration of his health was painful to watch for anyone who had followed the show, but what the cameras captured only told part of the story. Behind the scenes, Richard Harrison's declining health created a new layer of complexity in the dynamic between him and his son Rick. The roles that had been established over decades, father as authority, son as student, were shifting in ways that were emotionally profound and professionally complicated. Rick Harrison has been remarkably open about the grief he carried following his father's death in June 2018. The old man passed away at 77 after a long battle with Parkinson's disease. But grief in the context of a television show isn't a private thing. It becomes part of the narrative, part of the brand, part of the ongoing story that the network needs to keep telling. There is something almost cruel about the way reality television processes loss. The show goes on, the negotiations continue. The next item comes through the door and needs to be appraised. And the world watches, and the cameras roll. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, a man is dealing with the death of his father in front of millions of strangers. Here's what the departure of the old man revealed about Rick Harrison that no negotiation scene ever could. Beneath the expertise and the sharp business instincts and the controlled, calculating persona that television had made famous, there was a son who loved his father deeply. And losing him changed Rick in ways that rippled through every relationship at the shop. The gold and silver pawn shop after the old man was a different place. Not worse, not better, but fundamentally different. And the question of how Rick navigated those relationships, how he managed the grief while maintaining the business and the show, is one of the most human stories buried inside the Pawn Stars mythology. The expert who knew too much. Pawn Stars built part of its appeal on the parade of experts who appeared to authenticate items and provide historical context that even Rick Harrison couldn't supply on his own. These experts became beloved recurring characters in their own right. And one of the most fascinating dynamics in the show's history involved the relationship between Rick and the network of specialists he depended upon. But what happens when an expert's credibility becomes entangled with the show's credibility? What happens when someone whose presence is meant to add authenticity becomes instead a source of controversy? The show's relationship with various experts over the years illuminates something important about how Rick Harrison operates. He values expertise above almost everything else. In his world, knowing what something is worth and being right about it is the foundation of survival. Every dollar he overpays for a misidentified item is a dollar taken from his family, his business, his legacy. So when questions arose about appraisals, about whether certain assessments were shaped more by television drama than by genuine market values, it struck at something Rick Harrison held sacred: the integrity of the deal. There were multiple occasions when items featured on the show received valuations that were later questioned by the broader collecting and antiques community. And while television always involves some degree of dramatization and simplification, the line between entertainment and misinformation is one that Rick Harrison, given his genuine expertise, was always deeply uncomfortable about crossing. The tension between what makes good television and what is actually true, between the drama the producers wanted and the accuracy that Rick's professional reputation demanded, created fault lines within the show that viewers rarely saw. But those fault lines were real, and they affected relationships. Here's something to consider. Rick Harrison built his reputation on being the person who cannot be fooled. His entire brand rests on the premise that when he says something is genuine, you can trust that assessment. When that brand integrity was threatened, whether by sensationalized valuations, by controversies surrounding experts, or by the pressure to create dramatic narrative moments at the expense of factual accuracy, Rick responded the way he always responds to threats to what he's built. He drew a line, and some people found themselves on the wrong side of it. The fracture that changed everything. The departure that perhaps best illustrates the complex, sometimes brutal nature of Rick Harrison's commitment to his brand and his vision involves the increasingly complicated relationship between the show's original cast members and the evolving demands of a television franchise that had grown far beyond its modest origins. By the time Pawn Stars had completed multiple seasons and established itself as one of the most watched shows on History Channel, the casual, fly-on-the-wall documentary feel that had made it so appealing in the early days had been replaced by something more structured, more produced, more deliberate. The stories were curated. The drama was, if not manufactured, certainly shaped and guided. The negotiations that looked spontaneous had often been set up in advance. For people who had signed on to what felt like an authentic portrait of a family business, this evolution was sometimes deeply uncomfortable. There's a profound irony here that echoes the story of Aaron Kaufman leaving Gas Monkey Garage for almost identical reasons. The people who made the show authentic in the first place were increasingly constrained by the production machine that their authenticity had helped create. Rick Harrison, as the executive producer and the face of the franchise, sat at the intersection of all these pressures. He had to satisfy the network's demands for drama and ratings. He had to protect his business reputation in the very real world outside of television. He had to manage relationships with cast members who had varying levels of comfort with the increasingly scripted nature of their supposedly unscripted show. And he had to do all of this while continuing to actually run a pawn shop that served real customers every day. Can you see how impossible that balance becomes? The very success of Pawn Stars created contradictions that eventually became unsustainable. And when those contradictions became too large to paper over, when the gap between the authentic family business that viewers had fallen in love with and the television product it had evolved into became too wide to bridge, relationships broke. Some quietly, some loudly, all of them painfully. The aftermath, what remains when the cameras stop. With so many key relationships strained or severed, the Pawn Stars that exists today is a fundamentally different entity from the show that premiered and captured the imagination of the world. The original magic, that unrepeatable chemistry of personalities that somehow clicked together into something greater than the sum of its parts, cannot simply be rebuilt by finding new people to fill the vacated roles. Rick Harrison continues to build. He continues to negotiate, to evaluate, to seek out extraordinary items in his shop and in the wider world. His knowledge hasn't diminished. His business instincts remain as sharp as ever. But the context within which he operates has changed profoundly. What the parade of departures reveals, when you step back and look at them as a pattern rather than as isolated incidents, is something universal about the price of success. Every departure at Pawn Stars mirrors departures that happen in high-pressure creative environments everywhere. The specific details differ, the personalities involved differ, but the underlying dynamics are startlingly consistent. Success brings pressure. Pressure creates constraints. Constraints frustrate talented, passionate people who were drawn to the work precisely because of the freedom and creativity it once offered. Frustrated people eventually reach breaking points, and breaking points produce departures that leave everyone, the people who leave, the people who stay, and the audiences who watched it all unfold, a little poorer for the loss. The pattern we see at the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop echoes what played out at Gas Monkey Garage, what plays out in film studios and music labels and sports franchises and everywhere else that talented humans are gathered together in the pressure cooker of high-stakes, high-visibility success. This isn't Rick Harrison's failure. It's not the fault of the people who left. It's the inevitable consequence of building something that operates under extraordinary pressure and failing to resolve the underlying tensions before they become irreparable fractures. The lessons that outlast the drama. So what do we take away from all of this? What does the real story of these 5 departures teach us, not just about Pawn Stars, but about the human cost of success more broadly? First, success creates its own enemies. The bigger Pawn Stars became, the more rigid its requirements, the more constrained the people within it. This is the paradox at the heart of every major success story. Growth, the thing everyone works toward, is the very force that eventually threatens the culture that enabled the growth in the first place. Second, authenticity is impossible to manufacture. The early magic of Pawn Stars came from genuine personalities allowed to be themselves within a genuinely interesting setting. The moment the production tried to systematize that magic, to capture it in a bottle and reproduce it on demand, it began to lose the quality that made it special. You cannot produce authenticity. You can only create conditions where it might flourish and then get out of its way. Third, proximity to power is not the same as security. Several of the people who left Pawn Stars had been close to Rick Harrison for years, had contributed enormously to his success, had every reason to feel their positions were secure. But talent and contribution, however genuine, cannot override the fundamental dynamic when a powerful person decides a relationship has run its course. Fourth, the cameras always miss the most important moments. Everything that truly determined the fate of these relationships happened off-camera, in conversations and confrontations that the audience never saw. The real story of Pawn Stars, like the real story of most reality television, exists in the spaces between the episodes. And fifth, the people who watch from the outside often see more clearly than the people caught in the storm. The observer's perspective, the position of someone close enough to see the truth but detached enough to understand the larger patterns, is often the most valuable perspective of all. And it's the perspective that most rarely gets heard. The final question. Rick Harrison built something extraordinary. That is not in question. The gold and silver pawn shop and the television franchise it spawned changed the landscape of reality television and made the world of buying and selling fascinating to audiences who might never have given it a second thought. But every great success story has shadows. And the shadows of Pawn Stars, the strained relationships, the public controversies, the departures that left gaps that could never quite be filled, are as much a part of the real story as any legendary item that ever came through that iconic door. The 5 cast members whose relationships with Rick Harrison fractured and fell apart were not enemies or villains. They were talented, complicated human beings who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and, for reasons that were sometimes their own and sometimes beyond their control, reached their limits. And Rick Harrison, for all his expertise and his hard-won success, is ultimately a human being too. One who has paid real personal costs for the empire he built. One who has made decisions he likely replays in quiet moments. One whose story, like all genuinely human stories, cannot be reduced to simple heroism or simple failure. The truth, as it almost always is, lives in the complicated middle, in the space between what the cameras captured and what they missed, in the silence that exists after the credits roll and the production lights go dark, and the real people who built this thing are left alone with their choices and their memories. That silence has echoed long enough. Now you know what it held. What do you think? Could things have been handled differently? Were these departures inevitable, or were they failures of leadership, communication, or culture that could have been prevented? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This conversation is just getting started. And if you want more untold stories from behind the cameras of the shows you love, make sure you subscribe. Because the real story is always more fascinating than the one they wanted you to see.